I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna shout, I'm gonna let the reason out that his love goes on forever. I'm gonna take it all the way.
I'm Pastor Bill with your Maple Minute for this Thursday, March the 25th, 2021. Before we get into today's Maple Minute, can I remind you, if you're on Facebook, would you like this video post and then share it out so other people can see it too? And then make some comments. We'd like to hear from you, see what's going on in your life so we can connect with you. And then if you're watching on YouTube, do the same thing, but you have to subscribe to our channel here. And then if you would make some comments, we're trying to make it available so you can make some comments. There again, we just want to connect with you because we're all on this life's journey and we all want to help each other as we move through life and follow Jesus Christ. As we've been looking at Ecclesiastes through the lens of Solomon and his life, and Solomon was that guy who was imparted with great wisdom. In fact, he's known as the wisest man to ever live. Today, we would talk about Solomon's writings and we'd say, hey, you know what? Solomon's talking about working dumb, because that's what he really does talk about. You see, in the last couple of Maple Minutes, we've been talking about the subject of wisdom and folly, or wisdom and foolishness, because foolishness really was repulsive to Solomon being that wise. And today, his area of interest that we're going to cover in chapter 10 is the area of labor, language, and lunacy, how the craziness works with both labor and language. So let's get into it today as we look at the amusing picture that Solomon paints in his writings. In verses 8 through 10 of Ecclesiastes chapter number 10, he talks about foolishness and labor, and it's almost humorous. It really is. If you read what he's saying, you might not even get it if you're not thinking about it. He says this: "He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt, and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one succeed." You can see this contrast that he's doing here. And Solomon really gives us in these couple of verses, three verses, 5 illustrations of ignorance at work. And it's like, I don't know about you, but I always like sometimes to watch the videos of people doing stupid things. It just amuses me. It saddens me too. I think it did more to Solomon than amuse him. I think it sort of bothered him. And he's just pointing this out in his writings. The first instance he says is about the guy who's digging a pit. He says it's important, really, he says the person who digs a pit is going to fall in it. And he's showing me that foolishness in labor. And really what he's telling us is it's important for us to watch where we're walking and make sure that the hole that we digged isn't the one we're going to fall into in life. Now that works true for labor, but it also works true for all the ventures of life. Whatever you're doing, make sure you're not digging a hole that you're eventually going to walk back into. The next thing he talks about is the person who knocks down a wall. He says, be careful as you knock down a wall. And he points out this picture, and you have to remember this is in ancient times. They had a problem with snakes in that area, especially poisonous snakes. And he said, be careful if you knock out a section of wall and you stick your hand in there, that the snake, poisonous snake that's living in there doesn't come out and bite you. That's foolish labor, isn't it? It'd be sad to do that work and then get bit by it. The third area he talks about is the person who works in a stone quarry. And he says, he shows this picture of a person who works in the stone quarry. And what he says is, he says, make sure when you're working in the stone quarry that you don't pull out the stone that's supporting the bigger one, because that bigger one's going to roll on you. Be cautious, be careful. The fourth area he talks about is those who split wood, and that's probably something that this area of people that around Seagrove know a lot about. But he says, when you're splitting wood, be careful when you're splitting wood not to hurt your neighbor. That would be a foolish venture. I've been out with guys in our church splitting wood, and we always try and be careful. But sometimes there are guys that you get a little scared around because they're not as careful with their saws, chainsaws, and other things. You got to be careful when you're splitting wood, and that's foolishness and labor is what he's talking about. And then the fifth area he talks about is the person who's using an axe, using that maul. And he says, when you're using the axe, it's going to be a whole lot easier if you sharpen the edge. That's what he talks about. And what he gives us is these pictures of things that we're like, oh, I knew this. And there isn't some great truth behind it other than the truth that he says, hey, you know what? Wisdom helps you to succeed. And that's so much of what he's trying to get across. He says if we work and work and work and work stupid, we work foolish, we don't value things, accidents do happen, yes, but Wisdom helps you to succeed. That's his bottom line. And that's such great advice. The second area that he concentrates today on is not just foolishness in labor, but foolishness in language. In verses 11 through 15, and then we tag on with verse 20, he talks about 5 ways to the misuse of the tongue reveals a foolish heart. He says in verses 11 through 15, he says, if the serpent bites, there again, once again, he's using cultural things that they know about. He says, if the serpent bites before it's charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. He's not very good, is what he's saying. The words of the wise man's mouth win him favor. Good advice. But the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him and what will be after him. That's true. The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Even in your thoughts, in your bedroom, do not curse the rich, for the bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. You know, Solomon here, he's giving 5 ways the misuse of the tongue reveals the foolish heart. And first of all, it points out in verse number 11, he talks about this untamed tongue. And he uses the example of a snake charmer, and he says, you know what, if you don't learn, you're like learn how to tame your tongue, you're like that snake charmer who's not very good at charming the snake and gets bit by the snake. And that's so true. That's sort of what James says in his writings in James chapter 3. You know, an untamed tongue is much less charming than expected. And at the least predicted moment, it'll bite you back because you said the wrong thing. The second thing he tells us is in verse 12 is the unkind tongue. That's what he talks about. And he tells us that the unkind tongue releases words that can never be contained again. The words of the wise, though, are filled with grace, and that's what we have to realize. The third area he talks about is the unwise tongue. In verses 13 and 14, he said that the unwise tongue says way more than it needs to. He says the foolish tongue, man, it just doesn't know when to stop. It likes lots of words. It desires to be heard without hearing, to be known without knowing. It doesn't care about truth or even the people listening. It wants attention, and that's an unwise tongue. The fourth area of the tongue is the unreasonable tongue. In verses 14 and 15, he says the unreasonable tongue always talks about what they're planning for the future and how the future will play out and what they intend to accomplish, but in reality we know that they get nothing done. They don't fulfill or finish anything. They make a lot of plans. They talk about projects they're going to do, but they never get anything done. That's the unreasonable tongue. And then he finishes up in verse 20 and talks about that unfaithful tongue. And the unfaithful tongue is that tongue that says things it should never say. He warns you not to repeat things because some bird might just hear you and fly off and tell the person that you said it. And that's true. So, as Solomon points out here in two aspects of this foolishness in living, he warns us about the foolishness of our work, our labor. And we want to make sure we're working wise and not doing foolish things. And those are pretty obvious, but wisdom is so important in our success. So as you go about your week, as you go about your day, and whatever you're doing, ask yourself the question, is this the wise thing I'm doing? Because I find myself at the end of doing stupid things, paying a price usually, and being the guy that said, yeah, I wish I had done this wiser, it wouldn't hurt so much. And then secondly, probably more importantly than just being wise in our labor, is being wise in our language. You know, we don't want to have an untamed tongue. We don't want to have an unkind tongue. We don't want to have an unwise tongue. We certainly don't want to be unreasonable in our tongue or language, and definitely don't want to be unfaithful. Let's make sure that the words we say are kind words, and they are full of grace, because words that are full of grace are a whole lot easier to swallow than sometimes the words we speak that are unkind and are foolish. So how are your words today? Are your words full of grace and truth? Truth alone hurts, but grace softens the blow. So let's make sure as we speak to people, we're speaking the language of love with grace and truth, just like Jesus would. And let's encourage someone along the way.
'Cause his love goes on forever. His love reaches reaches to the high